Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this week's edition of Unvarnished Football. I'm Michael Jackson of the Game Before the Money. With me, as always, Upton Bell, former NFL executive, former director of player personnel for the Baltimore Colts, the world champion Baltimore Colts, winning Super Bowl V, and also former general manager of the New England Patriots. And his father was NFL commissioner and founded the Philadelphia Eagles. Upton also owned his own football team, the World Football League's Charlotte Hornets. So we gave you a lot of insight on drafting last week before the NFL draft. Now we're going to give you some insight on draft results, because this is what we're going to be looking at moving forward after this 2026 draft. Upton, first of all, what can you tell us about what kind of results can teams expect after this 2026 draft?
If they're lucky, maybe 10 to 20% success rate. I mean, it is even more so now, Michael, and I know you're going to give statistics that back up a lot of what I'm saying. And basically, when I look at this draft, it wasn't considered a strong draft to begin with. In fact, a weaker draft. And of course, the people are giving their marks already on who was successful and who wasn't. And I say to even the experts that I was watching again this morning on ESPN, as they talked about, I mean, they've spent more time on the NFL draft and the postmortems. This is like 4 or 5 days later than they did on the NBA playoffs or the baseball season or anything. So it shows you how the draft itself has grabbed people to the point of they will be talking about this in June. And yet, all of the talk about it, all of the interest in it, all of the fans, thousands, I think over 300,000, pushed their way through Pittsburgh to watch the draft live there. All of this, and I can tell you, is maybe 10 or 20% of the players drafted this year will either start or maybe not even make a club, maybe a taxi squad, as I call it. So it is truly a bigger gamble, Michael, today than it was when I was drafting in the 60s or even in the 70s, or you could go all the way through in the 80s. What really added the burden onto it, the merger brought from 16 teams in the NFL, 10 teams in the AFL to 26 teams, and then further expansion to 32 teams. So if I look at it logistically, what has happened is a player taken in, like, let's say the 26th pick, or all the way up to the 32nd pick. They're really, by the old standards, even though the players are much better today, bigger, stronger, quicker, faster, all of that routine, you're really getting in the first round what would be in the past the second, third, or fourth round. So you tell me, you've got the statistics to back it up. What is your view of this?
Well, I looked at the 2024 draft, 2023 draft, and 2022 draft. I did that on profootballreference.com. Now, the 2024 draft, that's only a couple of years ago. There are over 10 players who are not active in the NFL right now. And that's just a couple of drafts ago. And only 88 of the 257 players picked have been a regular starter on their team at least one of those 2 seasons. So to back up what you said, that's 34%. And you were saying about a 20% success rate. Well, the 2023 draft, out of 259 picks, almost 10% of the players are inactive right now. And in fact, there are 26 players who are listed as inactive on Pro Football Reference. But then there are 4 other players additionally who are on active rosters who haven't played since 2023, and then 20 more who didn't play last year. So that means almost 20% of the players taken in the 2023 draft didn't play at all in 2025. That's only 2 years after the draft. Now, I said that there are 26 players who are out of the league. Only 27 players drafted that year have been 3-year starters. So there's about an equal amount of players who are inactive as there are who are still starting for their teams. And that's just 2 years ago.
So the bottom line is that you spend more money. Let's take a look at the season itself, the complete drafting, but the complete scouting season. Most of the teams already have scouts out in all different parts of the country right now. In fact, I would originally in Baltimore leave probably the end of January and not come back. This is for spring practice, and not come back till probably almost June. Just going from the north to the south, to the west, and then to the far west, and then to the Pacific coast, and either flying or driving, combination of it, to take a look at all of these players. Because I did it myself, we had some help, and were part of a scouting combine. I knew every player. I could sit down and you could throw out a player to me at Galouche Tech, and I would know height, weight, speed, intelligence numbers, stuff like that. Now, today, with much bigger scouting staffs and millions of dollars spent, you could probably get the same readout. But in this case, how many people personally see as personnel directors every top player? I'll tell you how they see them. Repetitive. I mean, you've got the combine in Indianapolis. You've got pro days. You've got college days. You've got all of these things to the point of, you just keep saying to yourself, I would, if I was doing it, saying, when the hell is too much too much? And yet it all leads into, and again, the draft was much earlier because in those days you were forced to make a decision because you didn't wait until May or late April to have a draft. You would do it probably in November, December, maybe January, depending upon whether you were competing with another league or not, which we were at one time in the 60s. So this is not to deny or say we were any better then. It's to kind of point out the comparisons of how much money you spend, how much time you spend, how much you blanket the country, and then you get into, now they call it the war room, and everybody's being televised, slapping each other on the back, all those other things, to me, that they're kind of annoyances, but that's part of the shtick of getting the fans involved in it. But what is really the bottom line? If football wins and losses are the bottom line, what is the bottom line about the teams year in and year out that seem to draft well, trade well, yet of the 32 teams, why are 16 teams, I won't say they stink, but why are they constantly mediocre? Why are the Arizona Cardinals a bunch of stiffs every year, even if they draft a top player? But it's not only the top player, Michael. It's basically the rest of your draft. And there was more commotion here over Mike Vrabel skipping the third day of the draft to settle his own personal problems. And I said to myself, when is the last time any head coach would head out on the, in my opinion, the most important thing about the draft is the last day of the draft. In our case, we did it all in one day or a day and a half. But that's where you find the people that you don't have to pay as much for, but that's where you find the people that really could make your draft or make your team more important.
It gives your team depth. It gives you find those value picks in the later rounds. I remember a lot of analysis being put into the mid to late round picks in the NFL draft when I was growing up in the 80s. And commentators would talk about that, how some of these mid to late round picks were really making the differences on the teams, not necessarily as star players, but players who were making plays on the field, in the trenches, at linebacker, maybe not the headline guys, but the guys who are the added overall beef of a team rather than filler.
Well, not only that, taking a back, which is what we like to do, moving backwards and forwards. If you take a look at, let's say, today's 53-man roster, which eventually will be, I believe, 60-man roster when they put in 18 games instead of 17 games, and the league keeps expanding or whatever they're going to do. We had a 40-man roster, and a lot of the players that we would draft if we were successful later on, even free agents, made a very important part of that 40-man roster. You had less people to work with, and those guys better be ready to play or at least play part-time. And there are many players. The last player that I took in the draft before I left Baltimore to come to New England, because we won the Super Bowl that year. So we were picking 26 that year. The last player I took in the draft before I left to become the Patriots general manager was a player by the name of Don Nottingham. Everybody laughed. Short, squatty, good, tough player. He ended up playing a lot for the Colts. I mean, and there were many other players that were signed as free agents. Another example, Tom Mitchell from Bucknell, a tight end, was originally drafted somewhere in the middle rounds by the Oakland Raiders. He was on waivers. He was cut. Now, John Mackey was, in the stellar part of his career. So I went to Shula and I said, listen, I'm going to recommend, because we had coaches meetings at the end of training camp and we took a look at, and I was included in part of this, we took a look at cutting the squad and who needed to stay and who needed to go. And it would involve me too because of the players I drafted. And it would put me right on line and line of the fire of the coaches. They would either say to me, Upton, you had a really crappy draft, or, okay, we like this guy, we like that guy. So I said at the meeting, I said directly to Shula, I said, Mackey, if he gets hurt, and in those days, players played through a lot of injuries, and it was completely different. So I said, there's a player from Bucknell. He's a tight end by the name of Tom Mitchell. I've seen him play. I know it's in a smaller league than the Big Ten or the SEC. I think this guy can play. I think that the Raiders have been forced to cut him, whatever the reason. So we did pick him up. And as Mackey played over the years, especially the year that we won the Super Bowl, Mitchell played a lot. So this way we could give Mackey more rest. And Mitchell was a terrific blocker and turned out to be a hell of a pass catcher. And so, therefore, I looked at it and said, not only waivers, but other parts of the NFL where you can build a team, and you can build it because there are less teams and more people know what's really going on. Now, I mean, look at it. It's like a stampede. So,
Well, I'm glad we're talking about this, and I've got some statistics to back you up. Although it was one of the first blog posts I ever put on thegamebeforethemoney.com. This was 12 years ago. But I looked at this was right after the Broncos against the Seahawks Super Bowl, when the Seahawks defeated the Broncos. Coincidentally, the Seahawks were Super Bowl champions just like this year. But the Seahawks, I'm looking right now, I did a pie chart. I felt really proud of myself for posting a pie chart online. But only 54% of that Seahawks Super Bowl championship team that defeated the Broncos, only 54% had been drafted. They acquired, this is the starting lineup. I'm sorry. Of the starters, only 54% had been drafted. 16, almost 17% were undrafted. How about that? And about an equal amount were signed as veteran free agents, and about 8% were acquired via trade. Now, the Broncos, only 40% of their starters have been drafted. So that tells you both Super Bowl teams had fewer than or less than 60% of their starting lineup that they acquired via draft. And that's very telling. And that corroborates what you said. You got to build a team with more than just a draft.
and again, going all the way back, going all the way back to the original drafts back in 1936. And I know it's repetitive, but it's really true that four of the people drafted, and it only went like 7 rounds, four of them ended up in the NFL Hall of Fame. They had no information other than calling out the coaches that they knew around the country or Street and Smith Magazine. So what does that tell you? What happened then really in some ways, in a bizarre way, happens again today. Everybody is spending so much time going over and over and over people, but it's Michael, it's supply and demand. That how many players are really out there that are really can't miss? Very few. I mean, how were the Baltimore Colts and how were the Cleveland Browns and how were the Rams built? The Rams had a genius by the name of Eddie Cotell. Eddie Cotell was the first modern day scout who belongs in the Hall of Fame. It's ridiculous he's not in the Hall of Fame. He was the first, this is back in the 40s. He was the first one to get in a car and drive across America the way I used to do in a different way. He drove across America. He was the first to go to the African American school, starting off with Grambling and going all the way through and staying out forever. And from Eddie Cotell and the Rams drafting, this is in the 40s, they had so many players that they either had to cut or trade. And as a result, the Cleveland Browns, when they came into the NFL in the 50s, I believe when they came in and they beat the hell out of the champion Eagles in the opening game of 1950, the Cleveland Browns were so loaded with talent that I thought that they were better than any NFL team when they came over from the All-America Conference. And those players, a lot of those players were either drafted, they were traded away, they were swapped for draft choices, and that helped build the Baltimore Colts. I mean, Art Donovan, Gino Marchetti, look at it. The players that are in the Hall of Fame that were free agents or gotten through trade, uh, very few through drafting at that time. So it reinforces. We keep going back to the beginning and working our way up and saying, listen, it's great. The drafting methods and all the things that go on today, it's even better that the fans are really into it and have discovered that the draft is the biggest thing going on in the league next to the Super Bowl and the playoffs. But if you look at its history, if you really sit down and study the whole thing, it still comes back to one thing. With with knowledge added to it, it's still a crapshoot.
Absolutely, as we have seen both through your stories and through statistics. And going back to the just the 2022 draft, that's just 4 years ago. Remember, the average player's career has consistently been 3.5 years.
Never changed. Michael,
Throughout,
never.
yeah,
1946, my first year at the Bears training camp, 3.5 years. Isn't it ironic? It's never changed.
it hasn't. And 2022, that draft, um, less than 10% of the players drafted in that draft have been 4 year starters, and only 62 total players out of 262 taken have started 3 or 4 years. So that's 200 draft picks that started 2 years or fewer. Um, and in fact, only about half of them had at least 1 year of starting. So that tells you right there, one, if you're expecting a Super Bowl championship based on the draft, unless you're the 1970s Pittsburgh Steelers, then you're likely going to be disappointed. You have to find sources outside of the draft. Now, it's great that that so many people are excited about the draft now. I like the interest in the draft. I like the fact that people understand that there are a lot of ways, a lot of important things that need to be done to build a team, and the draft is one of them. And I like that fans are excited about the draft. But the reality is the draft is one singular component to it. And especially now with free agency, and especially now that the draft is 200 and some picks total, you're going to have to find players elsewhere, and you're going to have to be more resourceful. Now, Upton, do you remember off the top of your head, I can look this up if you don't, but how many players were like picked when you guys had 20 round drafts and 15 round drafts? How many players total were taken? Do you remember a rough estimate?
Taken by the Colts or just by the league period?
By the league period.
Probably about 300.
Probably about 300. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's about the same amount of players total. I'm just going to randomly look up the 1965 NFL draft here, and we'll see how many players were taken, and it was 280. So and that was 20 rounds. So there were only, as you said, there were far fewer teams. So even though they had 20 rounds, it's about the same amount of players taken. And you were commenting how even in the 60s you needed to find players from other sources. Here is, and that 65 draft, Gale Sayers was Rookie of the Year. Dick Butkus was also in that draft. Guys like Craig Morton. Craig Morton had a great long career. Joe Namath picked in that draft. And then, of course, you with the 14th overall pick in the 1965 draft, Upton Bell, and the Baltimore Colts select Mike Curtis, linebacker out of Duke.
Belongs in the Hall of Fame. And if you look at and the thing about that draft, every draft that I had, and I'm not bragging, I'm just saying the difference between then and now. Every draft I had was a pretty successful draft. I would say better than 50% made it in each one of the drafts I had. And why do I attribute that? Not so much to my genius or lack thereof, but the numbers. I knew what I wanted. Our coaches were well prepared. That's another thing that I think I've talked about in the past that might be different from today. I know it's different from today. Shula insisted, as we view back before him, that the coaches go out every weekend, even when we're playing on the road, that I had to arrange their travel, and each coach would go to look at the players at the colleges in games that were their positions. For instance, Don McCafferty, who was the running backs coach, the offensive backfield coach, he went to see all the running backs. Chuck Knoll, let's say when we got him later on as an assistant coach, he went to see all the defensive backs and linebackers. So Bill Orensbarger would look at the defensive linemen. All of them went out. And the thing is, after the games were over and they would fly back in if we were on the road, Shula would first of all ask me, because I would always join the team on the road or come right back that night. And the next thing, when I would walk into the locker room before the game, Shula would be right on me. All right, Uppy, what did you see? What the hell's going on? Make a decision, blah, 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 blah. He wanted to know, and he wanted his coaches to know. So when we went into a draft, it wasn't just me saying to the coaches, these are the people I recommend. They and I would get into arguments or in agreement about certain players at their position, because they had seen, and it might only be one or two games. And by the way, also, Michael, they had territories that I assigned them to in the springtime, that they would go out and do that. So they basically, unlike today, those coaches, your assistant coaches, and sometimes in Shula's case, if he wanted to see a particular player, he would go out. So we all went out. And that would make for great arguments or for great agreements on who were the best people. Today, you've got coaching staffs up to 30 people, and you have all of these scouts and all the computers and everything else. And again, I think it causes more confusion than anything else like that, no matter what they say or how organized they may be. We knew what we wanted, and we went into a draft knowing what we wanted. Now, the irony is, the year that Gale Sayers and Dick Butkus were taking the same draft, I always said that and the Steelers draft in the early 70s were the greatest drafts I've ever seen. The Bears didn't have, and back to 1936 I go again. The Bears didn't have necessarily a big scouting staff. They had one or two people, that was it. Yet, they took two guys that I immediately saw as Dick Butkus and Gale Sayers. I said, someday those two guys are going to be in the Hall of Fame, which they were. Sayers might be one of the greatest broken field players or runners I've ever seen. Butkus is on top of my list. Butkus, Lawrence Taylor, and Ray Lewis are the three greatest linebackers I've ever seen. Butkus probably would be number one, maybe number two to Lawrence Taylor, but Butkus played inside, Taylor played outside. But the minute I saw them take that, I said, "How the hell did they do that?" I mean, those guys, they don't do a lot of scouting, yet they took the two of the greatest players of their era. There's an example. Again, smaller drafts. Uh, you don't have to be a genius to watch Gale Sayers or Dick Butkus play in college. In fact, I remember Don McCafferty, who went to Michigan or to Illinois for spring practice, and I was covering the Big Ten. He came back and he wrote, and I put in my book. He wrote on his scouting report only a couple of words. He said radar, R-A-D-A-R, radar knows, take him number one. That was his only comment. That's all you needed. So there are great comparisons, and this makes it great fodder for people who are listening to our show to know that going back all the way to the original, there are answers, but really in the end, there are no answers.
And you really bring up an important point. There's, of course, a saying that we all know: too many cooks in the kitchen spoil the stew. Now, back in your day, it's you, Chuck Noll, Don Shula, Bill Arnsparger, maybe a couple other Colts assistants, and you guys are collectively making the decision. Now, like you said, large coaching staffs, along with the general manager. Of course, you had a general manager as well, who I'm almost positive would have had say into who would be drafted. But you had to get fewer people. You had to get far fewer people in agreement on whom to select back then. And now you've got to sell that to quite a few people. There's probably politics involved. Hey, we went with your pick in round 4. Now we gotta go against what you're thinking to please some other people. There might be, I'm hypothesizing, but I know how human interactions work, and there might be those sorts of things going on as well.
Well, the other thing too is, remember, then versus today, the general manager at the time, Don Kellett, and then later on Harry Humes, when Joe Campanella died suddenly of a heart attack, that basically it was Shula. The general manager in that case didn't really interfere, and neither did the owner, Cal Rosenblum, who probably knew as much about football as any of these owners today, with the exception of Jerry Jones. But what you had there is you had a decision-making group. And believe me, as I think I said last week, I still thought in the 16th round we have a chance to get a really good player. So I drafted a basketball player by the name of Preston Pearson, who played, as I said last week, or a week before, in 4 different Super Bowls. I right to the very end, not only did I take it seriously and make sure that everything we could do to draft a good player, no matter what round it was. And then afterwards, I had an ex-player of the Colts, John Husvar. I got him and I said, listen, I'll pay you a certain amount. I want you to go out. Here's a list and sign every goddamn free agent you can find. And,
well, Drew Pearson told me when I got to sit down with him for the Texas Sports Hall of Fame. Drew Pearson told me he was really excited being signed by the Cowboys as a free agent to show up. Then he got to training camp and he found out there were 100 other guys just like him who they had signed as free agents, just casting as wide a net as possible to try to find some diamond in the rough. Of course, Drew Pearson was a diamond, but there were a lot of guys who were leaving pretty. Now, this probably happened with the Colts too. Probably guys show up and they're like, "Oh, I'm not going to make this team. I'm just going to go back on home to Baton Rouge or Trenton or wherever I'm from." Did that happen with the Colts too? I'm guessing.
Well, this is another story, and I'm in Alex Hawkins, who wrote who was the original Captain Who, and a real character of the Colts. In his book, he talks about one of the things that Weeb Eubank did. By the way, I want to correct myself. I meant Preston Pearson, if I said Drew Pearson, who was a basketball player who did, as I said, play in 4 different Super Bowls. But anyway, 1960, might have been 1962 or 1963, my first or second year at the Colts, and I had not gone to the personnel department yet. I was working in the ticket office. But I was a sprinter in high school and college, and basically, Weeb Eubank had said to me one day, he said, Uppy, I was in sneakers, he said, I want to see how fast. I was bragging, I was just kidding around at practice, summer camp. And so he said, let me see how fast you can run the 40. So in sneakers, I ran a 4.640, which probably today would be around a 4.4, something like that.
On turf, on cleats. In
yes.
the proper footwear in a contained environment.
Right. So I remember Lenny Moore saying to me and Lenny Lyles, who are both extremely fast, saying, hey, man, he said, you want to run against me? I said, no, I don't want to run against you. So, I mean, things were much different and more open then. So we insisted that I would come on the road with the team. And in those days, wherever we went, we were so popular, the Colts and their image and everything else like that, that free agents would show up at our practices and ask, would we be interested in signing them? So Weeb's Eubank's out was, well, if you can't beat somebody from our ticket office, you can't make our team. So I would run against these people, and then we would then say to them, well, you can't beat Upton Bell. He works on our ticket office. I can't sign you. That was his excuse. So this one day we're in San Francisco, and a guy by the name of Billy Baird showed up at our practices and said, Coach Eubank, would you be interested in signing me? I'm a defensive back. I'm a free agent, blah, 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 blah. And Weeb said, well, he said, we've got Upton Bell over here. Why don't we have you run against him? And so I did, and Baird barely beat me. I think I ran like a 4.5 or 4.6. He ran faster. Now, here's the irony of it. 1968 Super Bowl. Who was the starting defensive safety for the New York Jets? Billy Baird. We had not forgotten him. We didn't sign him for the Colts taxi squad, but 5 or 6 years later, after he'd been fired by the Colts, 68 Super Bowl, I'm looking down and I'm saying, oh my God, that's Billy Baird, the guy who barely beat me in the 40-yard dash in San Francisco back in 1964. So that's, you could find people. You really, yes, it'll happen occasionally, but it's harder to find people today. Because, again, you have big squads. Now you have what I still call the taxi squad. And now players can be drafted off them or signed off them after a certain period of time. I said, wait a minute, you've got all these people running around, and now you have a taxi squad, and now you have teams trying to steal players off your taxi squad for their taxi squad. I'm saying, What's the end of this whole thing? Back to your percentages. How many of them really make it?
On the practice squad, from the practice squad. It doesn't happen often. It happens occasionally, but it doesn't happen often. Now, Upton, you talked about Preston Pearson, and you drafted him as a basketball player. He had just played basketball in college. He hadn't played football in college. Now, back in those days, I just kind of want to give perspective to people. In those days, the NFL draft was nowhere near the spectacle that it is today. In fact, not even the players knew what was going on. When I talked to Bob Greasy for the book The Game Before the Money, I asked him how he found out when he was drafted, and he was put this into perspective, he was the number 4 overall pick in the draft. And a few days after the draft, he was one of his assistant coaches passed him in a hallway and said, "Oh, Bob, I got to tell you, you've been drafted by the Miami Dolphins." And Bob was like, "Oh, okay, thanks." And it was just kind of in passing that he was told that. Now, Upton, I'm guessing when you called Preston Pearson and or other draft choices, they may not have even known they had been drafted by the Colts until you gave them a phone call.
Well, it's not only that, it was today for instance, there have been conflicting stories about the Rams and the drafting of the Alabama quarterback Ty Anderson. And by the way, I did watch him quite a few times on television. I'm saying, what the hell are they taking him in the first round for? I could be totally wrong about it. And there were 2 stories out. One, that the head coach of the Rams didn't like the choice, and then it comes out a couple of days later that he did like the choice. In fact, he admitted that he had a secret meeting with him, and that basically he liked what he saw, and they talked for hours about this and about that. But he knew ahead of time that he probably, from the coach, would be drafted. There's no question. When I called Preston Pearson, he kind of said, "Are you kidding?" You know, you look at it and you say, well what? I remember before I even got a hold of him, I think a writer out of Milwaukee called me, or out of Illinois, and said, "Why did you take Preston Pearson?" I said, "Because he's a damn good athlete." And then he got in an argument with me, and I hung up the phone. But most of the players then, with the exception, in I think 1967, when we took Bubba Smith as the first choice in a trade with the New Orleans Saints, we took him number 1 in the country. He was the first player drafted. And of course, he was such a big name from the Michigan State team that had 4 number 1 draft choices, and that great defensive group that tied Notre Dame 10-10, tie one for the Gipper, as they said. But basically, he did know kind of ahead of time, but still, we called him, we announced him, and even though it was picked up nationally, just the local writers from Baltimore came in and covered, knowing that we would have the first choice. So each one of the players you would call and you would let them know they were drafted. It's probably the case of the Dolphins, particularly before Shula got there. Nobody wanted to go to the Dolphins. They had no money. And so he wouldn't know. Or they wouldn't know enough to call him and say, "Hey, we've drafted you." I always got to remember those times were probably more fun, but there are a lot of incompetence going on. I always made sure that I called every player that we were drafting. In fact, that's the way we found out the year that I had what I thought was maybe my best draft. And I was the assistant personnel director at that time. And we found out, we took Mike Curtis number 1, and then I thought Ralph Neely was the best offensive lineman in the game in college, and we took him number two, and we were warned by the league because we were fighting with the AFL that Neely probably would not want to sign there. That if he couldn't stay in Texas, um, he was not going to sign with the Colts. So we immediately then traded his rights to Dallas for a high draft choice because again we had no choice in that situation. So somebody had to let him know. But those were crazy times too, jumping around a little bit because uh, both leagues were competing for the same players. And in the case of a guy by the name of Harry Shue from Memphis State, who was considered one of the top draft choices, he was hidden out in Las Vegas by the Oakland Raiders, and the NFL babysitters were closing in on him to make him a counteroffer. And the next thing you know, he was gotten on a. They got him on a plane. The Raiders did and flew him to Hawaii, so nobody could get to him. I mean, there's a whole other book, Michael. Maybe you should write it on the war between the two leagues. I mean, the stories were incredible. So,
Well, Upton,
again,
maybe we can do next week the
oh,
AFL
sure.
NFL war and
Oh,
and kind of get into that.
that would be great because the stories are incredible, and to the point of what was were certain players kidnapped? Maybe against their own volition. Who knows? But that part of it is today. It's a big show. You got to get the owner involved. That's the other thing that's changed, with the exception of Jerry Jones. How many of the owners really know of a player's value or what is going on there? Well, example, Jimmy Haslam of the Cleveland Browns. He's walking down the street. This is 3 or 4 drafts ago, longer than that ago, and a taxi driver comes up to him and says, "You should draft so and so." So Haslam was asked after they drafted the guy, the taxi driver, said to him, the quarterback that they drafted, said to him, he said, basically, he was asked, "Why did you draft that guy?" He said, "Well, couple of taxi cab drivers told me I should draft him." I mean, that's what has happened. Everybody wants in on the picture, and everybody wants to be in the draft room. The owners like Bob Kraft on the phone, but the minute the Mike Vrabel announces their choice of an offensive lineman from basically Utah, what happens? He puts the phone immediately to Kraft, who then wants to talk about him. So that would not happen. Again, Carol Rosenblum, who owned the Colts, who used to play football in college, kind of knew the pro game. He wasn't even there on draft day. He made sure that he wasn't there. He wanted to make sure that Shula, myself, the people who were doing the drafting, all he wanted to know is the results. Were they any good or not? Now, every owner, and that's fine, if you pay billions of dollars for a team and you want to get your face on TV, that's fine. But it's so diffuse now in what's happening. You've got the coach, you've got the general manager or the personnel director and the owner, and you go from place to place and you see the pictures of them in this war room with 55,000 people in attendance in the war room, and you're saying, is this really football, what we're seeing? Or is it, it's a talk show. So
It's a
all
spectacle. And as you've said, in 1936 at the first draft, the NFL couldn't even get any media to the
never
draft
showed
to
up.
cover it.
Never. Do you know the first time that the draft was announced? 2 weeks later. it made it into to them, which was the dominant force, not only in sports in the NFL. It made it into a newspaper. 2 weeks later,
Wow.
I, I, somebody needs to capture what it was like. Bob Lyons and my father's biography kind of captures it. The night before, I mean, all the owners came in. Most of them were broke or near being broke. And so Bert Bell's persuaded his father to have the draft at his hotel. Ironically, his father, John C. Bell, told his Bert Bell, his son, that he thought the NFL was a joke and that he wasn't going to give him a nickel to buy the Philadelphia. Well, turned out to be the Philadelphia Eagles, and he said, "I love you, but I'm never going to give you a cent for that league." But he agreed to let him have the hotel the night before. So my father greeted all of the owners, there were only 7 of them, and said, welcome, welcome, boys. The drinks are on me. So the night before, they set up a blackboard, and they're having drinks, and they're arguing, and they're calling out to these different any contacts. Hello, coach. What about so-and-so player? Or somebody says, let's send out for some Street Smith magazines. And so there it was. And one of the greatest drafts in history. Basically, nobody knew what the hell they were doing.
And yet they still drafted 4 Hall of Famers.
But that's, I guess, always will be my mantra. Back to my point. It is a crapshoot. Find a way to control it enough. Get the percentages on your side. Don't take a flyer on a draft choice early. Don't project something that isn't there. I see teams that still do that, and I understand why now that they do it. With all the money, millions that they've spent on the scouting system, the Patriots' first choice, Will Campbell, last year, everybody said he has short arms, he's very aggressive, terrific kid. If you're going to put him out at left tackle, he's going to have his problems. Well, he did have his problems. Now, he did get hurt. In the playoffs, he had really a terrible playoffs. And as you saw in the Super Bowl, what happened to him? The defense, the Seattle defense, ran over him, went right by him, and got to the quarterback. And that was, I said, at halftime, I said, game over.
Well, we've got just about 2 or 3 minutes left, Upton. Now, and we can talk more about this next week. We'll analyze the draft a little bit more next week, and we'll also talk about the AFL, NFL war. But are there any teams that stand out to you that may have had a better draft than others? I like what the Browns did, getting a couple of receivers. I think Shedeur Sanders is an excellent quarterback. I know we totally disagree on that, but I like how they got Sanders a couple of weapons. I think the Cowboys had a pretty good draft. Are there any teams or players that stand out to you that did a better job?
I think both the Giants and the Jets did well, particularly the Jets. I think they got their defensive player. They got a tight end. They got some good people. I also think that the Giants did pretty well. But Michael, we have to be careful of this because we need to see them in training camp, and we need to see if they can really play. Interesting about the Cleveland situation, because today I didn't know, other than Jimmy Haslam, that they had a managing general partner, whomever that person is, who came out and said, and I'm paraphrasing, forget Shedeur Sanders, Deshaun Watson's going to be the starter. And there was a whole argument this morning on ESPN, on Get Up, about what is the situation with Deshaun Watson. If he is still the best quarterback, and at one time they did point out, and I believe um, that he had as much talent as Patrick Mahomes until all this mess came, and then he got injured. But I still believe that he is going to be the starting quarterback at Cleveland, not Shedeur Sanders, because Michael, why is part of that? Because they owe him so much damn money.
Well, that's a factor. That's a factor in it. I'll tell you what. If your team ends up drafting for Sanders, watching his footwork, watching his downfield throws, I thought he was better than probably half of the starting quarterbacks in the NFL. Is he a superstar level? Not yet. Not right now. Does he have the potential? I think he has the potential to be a Pro Bowl level quarterback. I think he's got a better potential. If he gets a chance to play, and he gets a chance to be a team starter, I think he's got a much better chance to be a Pro Bowl player than he does to burn out.
I'm going to hold you to that, but you know what? It sounds to me like Deshaun Watson is going to be the starter, and not based upon any really reliable stuff, other than it was the worst contract I have ever seen given out in the NFL, and Jimmy Haslam is such a sucker for this. But you know what? That's where I can't picture a Carol Rosenblum or Dan Reeves or any of these people. You might say, well, they were cheap, but Unitas at the time got the highest contract, and that was only $25,000, which is not even a training camp bonus today. But when you look at who's making decisions, if Jimmy Haslam or the managing general partner, whoever that ghost may be of the Cleveland Browns, is saying Deshaun Watson is going to be the starter, then I'm going with the guy that's got the money and making the decisions.
All right. Well, Upton, really great show today. Really enjoyed it. Everybody check out the Upton Bell collection online at University of Massachusetts. You can also check out uptonbell.com. Please also check out thegamebeforethemoney.com. There's also the Game Before the Money podcast. Upton is on a lot of those episodes as well. Jerry Kramer, Hall of Famer for the Packers, is on the latest episode, and I'm about to drop a part 2 with Jerry Kramer. Everybody have a great week, and we'll come at you again next Thursday.